I'm Karaleigh Garrison, and this is Seeking Sunshine, where we are going to find the positive in the trials of life. 'Cause I'm seeking sunshine, I'm seeking sunshine, I'm seeking sunshine. Oh, 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 I'm seeking sunshine, I'm seeking sunshine, I'm seeking sunshine, I'm seeking sunshine. Hey guys, this is Karaleigh Garrison, and I am so excited that you are here for the very first episode of Seeking Sunshine. Today, I wanted to tell you my story. I think it's helpful for you to see kind of where I'm coming from with this podcast and get a glimpse of what's happened in my life, because it's been really crazy. I have a lot of stories to tell, and so I'm going to try to sum everything up, but sometimes I get caught up in the details and I want to delve into each of these stories. And I'm going to do that throughout these podcast episodes, but today I'm going to try really hard to just sum up my crazy life. So, back in 2008, I was 18 years old, and I had just graduated high school. I was accepted to Brigham Young University, which was the only college that I even applied to. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it's a really big part of who I am. And so that was the only college that I wanted to go to. I felt really strongly that was where I needed to go. So I graduated high school, and I worked as a sample lady at Costco over the summer, and then I went off to college. I grew up in California, and my parents drove me up to Utah in August for school. I wanted to go to school to sing. That was my big dream. I come from a big family, not number, but size. We're kind of on the plus side of things. The point is that I never thought that I could succeed singing on stage unless it was an opera. Opera seemed to be the only place where a big girl could be successful, where a big girl could be on stage and people would be okay with it. So I went to college to sing opera. In my first semester, I met my husband and married my husband only 7 weeks later, which was crazy, but I believe really strongly in Revelation. And I prayed about it, and I just knew that was the right thing for me to do. So we met in October, and we got married in November. And that same time was when I auditioned for the School of Music, and I was not accepted. And I was completely devastated. I planned to try again later, but in the meantime, I had to find a different major. And I ended up in the School of Family Life with an emphasis in sewing. I've been sewing my entire life. I actually made myself a skirt when I was in 5th grade for my very first dance, and it totally fell apart, and I wore it anyway. I wouldn't use a sewing machine, and so the whole thing was sewed by hand. It was a thing. But I've loved to sew for a long time, and so that's the area I decided to major in until I could get into the School of Music, which was my true dream. So my husband was working at a grocery store, and I was working as a sample lady at Costco, and life was fine. We fought a lot. We definitely had a rough start to our marriage. We didn't understand each other. We didn't understand the way each other thought or the way that we talked. Looking back, everything makes sense. But at the time, I just didn't know. I had no idea of the things that were coming. At the grocery store, my husband was the only male on the front end, and so it was kind of his unofficial duty to be the store bouncer anytime somebody was drunk or tried to steal something. Anytime something went wrong, he was the one who was in charge because he was the big guy, right? But it was causing him so much stress. He would have horrible back spasms and just be laying on the floor at the grocery store, writhing in pain. But at the time, we had no idea what that meant. Eventually, the two of us decided to quit our jobs because we hated them. And we went full-time into my own little business called Button Up Earrings, where I made button jewelry and sold it at craft shows. My amazing husband learned how to use a serger, and he serged hundreds of headbands for me. And we went around the state selling button jewelry. And you know what? We loved it. We got to spend time together that we had been missing out on when we were working at different places. We enjoyed creating together. And he's a great salesman, and he taught me a lot of really great sales tactics, and it was a really nice time. Around that time was when we decided that it was time for us to have a baby. And I felt so strongly that our baby was waiting for us, and I was very, very anxious to get pregnant. But it took us about 6 months, which in the grand scheme of things is nothing, but at the time felt like an eternity. We wanted her so badly. But eventually I did get pregnant, and Aurora Violet was born in May of 2010. She was such a good baby that I could take her to class with me. We could take her with us when we did craft shows. She was just that good. She was happy and quiet and beautiful and amazing. She was such a good baby. So life went on. We continued with school. It certainly wasn't easy taking an infant to class with me, but we made it work. And then in December of 2010, we felt that really strong call of inspiration that we needed to move to California, which is where my parents live, and we needed to move to their town. But we weren't done with our degrees yet. And it didn't seem to make any logical sense, but we prayed about it, and we prayed about it, and we knew that it was the right thing to do. So in December, we packed up our little apartment. We couldn't afford to move. We were broke college students. We were barely getting by on student loans and the little bit of money I was making from my button business. But we did not have enough money to move. We were hoping to make enough money at our yard sale to pay for a moving truck, and we just couldn't. And our church, our ward family came together and paid for a moving truck for us, and it was miraculous. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The men from our ward came in and just shoved everything into boxes and bags. Garbage, junk, things we didn't want. But we hadn't had time to pack because we'd been in school and we'd been doing craft shows all the time, and we definitely were not ready to move when we had to be out. And they came and shoved everything together in this moving truck, and we were out of there. And it was tough, but it was also miraculous. So we drove to California in our little car with our moving truck. We moved in with my parents, and right after we did that, I announced that I was pregnant with my second. And again, there's another blessing that was also really difficult. We were very grateful for a place to live, but all three of us, my husband and my newborn and I, shared a room, and the rest of my family and the three of us all shared one bathroom. And it was tough to go back home. It's never easy to go back home after you move away. But at the same time, it was a miracle. We needed it. We desperately needed their help, and they were great. They were amazing. Soon in February, we were able to get our own apartment. Jacob had gotten a job as a car salesman at a car lot. So we moved into our little apartment, and again, many blessings and many trials. We got a washer and dryer, and we hooked them up, and Jacob insisted that he knew how to do it himself, and so he plugged it in and forgot to hook up the drainage hose where it belonged. So he left for work that morning, and there I was. So I have my 10-month-old, my 10-month-old, and I was huge and pregnant with my second, and the apartment floods when I start laundry. And I panic, and I run up to the front office, and they shut off the water, and everything had flooded, and we had just moved in. There were boxes everywhere. So many things got ruined and destroyed. The water flooded underneath our neighbors, the wall that we shared with our neighbor, and a lot of their stuff got ruined too. And that was a huge trial. That was really crazy. So life went on. Jacob went to work for a water company selling water, and he did very well at that. I gave birth to Joshua in July of 2011, and his birth was wild. Joshua was 9 pounds. My labor with him was so short that I didn't have time to have any drugs. And my pregnancy with him was miserable. I was humongous. He was kicking me in the ribs and hitting me in the bladder all the time. And I was just miserable. But what do? You just wait it out, right? Jacob was working. I was home with Aurora, miserable and pregnant. And then finally, the day came. My parents in California had been able to drive up and see Aurora be born in the amount of time it took me to have her. because her labor was about 12 hours and that they had just enough time from when I went into labor to drive up and see her be born. But when Joshua was born in California, my labor was less than an hour and a half, and they did not make it to see him born. His birth was the kind of thing where the only reason that I got through it was because I had no choice. I was sobbing, begging the doctor to make it stop any way possible. I would have given anything to make that pain stop. But there was nothing they could do, and there was nothing I could do. And Josh was born at 9 pounds. I was really blessed that my sister was around and was able to help me care for my newborn. For like the first week of his life, she sat up with him all night so that I could sleep. It was a huge blessing to have her around. Our time in California was difficult. The next year is a blur of toddlers and babies and Jacob working as a salesman, and life was, you know how life is as a young mom. It's just a little bit crazy. Sleepless nights, it becomes kind of a blur. Anyway, I'm going to fast forward to 2013, which is it's at least the second worst year of our marriage. So 2013 happened. Ooh, it was crazy. So, beginning of 2013, Aurora was about 2.5, and she wasn't talking yet. She maybe had a couple of words here and there, but she was not talking like she needed to be. I talked to the pediatrician about it, and he didn't seem to think there was much of a problem, but he referred us to speech therapy. I also asked about Josh, and he said, Josh is much too young. Josh was about 18 months old, and he also wasn't talking, and kids are supposed to be talking by 18 months old. They're supposed to have some words, you know? They're supposed to have about 50, I think, by 18 months. Josh had no words either. And so I asked the pediatrician about Josh, and he said, Josh is too young, don't worry about it. He'll be fine. But he did refer Aurora to speech therapy. I called the speech therapy place, and something just didn't feel right. And we ended up not scheduling and not making an appointment. But I had a good friend who recommended a company that did early intervention. And they came out and they evaluated both Aurora and Joshua and determined that both of them qualified for services easily. They were actually really surprised that the pediatrician had just brushed off Joshua because Joshua seemed to be much, much worse than Aurora. There were a lot of newborn skills that he did not yet have, like eye contact and responding to his name. And at the time, I had no idea. I didn't know what that meant. So we started therapy. We started with early intervention, a few hours a week for each kid. But Aurora was about to turn 3, and this company hired somebody to come to our home and evaluate her for autism. I did not think she had autism. I didn't really know anything about autism, but I thought she was fine. So this psychologist comes to our home, and he watches her as she goes around the playground and picks up rocks and collects all the rocks. She doesn't come show them to me. She just picks up rocks. She won't play on the swings. She won't go down the slide. All she wants to do is pick up rocks. And Aurora was diagnosed with autism, and I was blown away. And the thing was, I knew that if she had autism, that Joshua definitely had autism. He was too young to be diagnosed yet, but he was way worse than she was. He had far less speech. He had far less connection to people than she did. But all in all, it was a devastating day when he sat down with me and told me that my daughter had autism. Jacob was off at work, and I was home alone. And that was pretty brutal, to be alone for that. And I don't remember who I called, but I called somebody and cried to them, and they were very supportive. But this was just the beginning of our autism journey, and I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about autism. So during this time, Jacob was working for a water company, and he was finally doing well enough in his sales that we were able to afford insurance for him. He was coming home every day from lugging water around in an incredible amount of pain. He would come home and he would sometimes curl up in a ball and lay on the floor and just cry in pain. But because we were able to finally afford insurance, he was able to finally get some medication to help him with his pain. And so he was started on opioids. And they helped him with his pain, but they also didn't. They also made things worse. Within the next few months, he became addicted to these opioids and was abusing them, doing anything he could to get higher doses. We didn't know it at the time, but he was actually depressed, and he was trying to self-medicate his depression with the opioids. In May of 2013, while all this was going on, my amazing grandmother passed away. She was such an incredible person, and it was really heartbreaking. It was really sad when I found out that she had passed on. And I still miss her so much. So we drove out a few hours to her house, and we helped pack it all up. And we had all the kids with us, and life was crazy. And about that same time, Jacob and I were both auditioning for Les Mis, which was a local company was putting on Les Mis. And both of us being singers, we were both really excited for this opportunity to be in a big show because we hadn't gotten to do that in so long. And so Jacob was cast as the lead, as Jean Valjean, which was incredible. It was a lifelong dream for him to play this role. I did not get cast. So I had my own feelings of jealousy and stuff, but it turned out to be probably a good thing because I needed to be home with the kids and not off at rehearsal every night, especially with therapy going on every day. They really needed me and my attention at home. But now Jacob was working full-time, hauling water all day, and then he was at rehearsal all night, and we felt like we never saw him. About the same time, he was also trying to do school online, and that didn't work out well. It was just way too much. We never got to see him. He was overwhelmed. He was addicted to opioids, and he was depressed, and life was really hard. We had more troubles as the show got closer that I won't go into, but it was a very, very difficult time for us. Eventually, his show opened. He was incredible in his role as Jean Valjean, even though we had many times, he had at least one show where he was so out of it from all the pain medication he had taken and having not eaten any real food that day. He was so out of it, he could barely function, and somehow he got through that show, and the only people who noticed were his family. That was a miracle in and of itself. We didn't trust him to drive home safely that night, and that was kind of the breaking point. It wasn't long after that where he decided that enough was enough, and he stopped cold turkey. He stopped taking his medication cold turkey because he knew that it was a problem and that something had to change. But the problem with quitting cold turkey is not just the withdrawals and all that. The problem is that he was still in pain. He was still depressed. He was still having this really hard time, and now he had nothing to help. We tried counseling, but that wasn't really helpful, and I'll tell you why. It's because counseling only works if you have two people who are whole coming together. And I mean, it can be helpful otherwise, but if you're not whole on your own, it's really hard to be whole as a couple. So I was still doing the therapy thing with the kids. Jacob and I were not getting along. I don't even think we were sleeping in the same bed at that time. We were really struggling in our marriage, and we almost didn't make it through that time. But he quit all of his drugs cold turkey, and he renewed his efforts to be better. And I did too, because certainly I was wrapped up with the kids and with their stuff, and I wasn't paying as much attention to him as I should have. I wasn't seeing all the pain he was in and all of his struggles because I was so wrapped up in my own. Anyway, that was about the time when we knew we needed to move. Jacob found a job in San Antonio, Texas, which is where his parents lived, and that coming February of 2014, we moved to San Antonio, Texas. This new job paid for us to move out there, and we had an apartment, and his parents got it all ready for us, which was amazing and miraculous. And it was a really hard drive because it's about a 24-hour drive from mid-California, and it was a very difficult drive. But we made it. We were exhausted, but we made it. So here we are in San Antonio, Texas. Jacob has a new job. I'm trying my very best to get everybody set up. Aurora had been in preschool, in special needs preschool in California, and I had to find her a new special needs preschool. We had to get reset up with therapy. It was really difficult. And I should mention, I was pregnant with our third, our miracle baby. I'll be honest, we were in such a bad place when I got pregnant with him that sometimes I wonder if it was immaculate conception, because we were not in a good place, and somehow I got pregnant with him. And being pregnant with him was one of the major factors that helped save our marriage. So we're in San Antonio, Texas. I'm doing everything I can to get our kids set up in schools and with therapies and with everything they need. I had to get a new OBGYN, and Jacob started this new job. And it only took, weeks, maybe months, before the whole thing fell through. This company wasn't what they said they were. The job wasn't what they told him it was. Nothing was as promised. And the whole thing fell through. So he found another job. And the same thing happened. It wasn't anything like what they said it was. And then it happened again. It happened 3 times in a row. 3 different jobs that fell through because the company was failing or wasn't honest about what the job actually entailed. And that was really hard. That was a rough time. But soon, Jacob was able to start working with his father because we now lived really close to his parents. And he worked with his dad doing laser engraving. And it was a good thing. He and his dad don't always get along super well. But other than that, it was really a good thing for him to do. Around this time was when Benjamin was born. He was born in May of 2014. But Benjamin's birth was really traumatic. Benjamin almost died when he was born. Everything was going great in his pregnancy. Except for pregnancy sucks and I was miserable. But beyond that, everything was fine. And I went in to get induced and I was telling the doctor, I said, "You don't understand. This child is going to be 10 pounds, born in half an hour at home by myself with 2 toddlers. I was panicking because they say that, subsequent children tend to be heavier and you have shorter labors. And Joshua was 9 pounds and his labor was only an hour and a half. And I was freaking out. So they decided to induce me. I was 39 weeks one day, and I went in to be induced. And they put me on Pitocin, and everything was fine. And I was on Pitocin for 24 solid hours because I was waiting for my doctor to come in and break my water because my water never seems to break on its own. Well, she was waiting until she was done at the hospital. And long story short, she broke my water. The cord kind of strung him up. They raced me into the OR where I had an emergency C-section. Benjamin was basically born lifeless. And then they took him down to a different hospital where he was put under medically induced hypothermia to stop brain swelling. Meanwhile, I was panicking and having really horrible infections from my C-section, and it was just kind of an awful experience. But Benjamin had a priesthood blessing from his dad, and he miraculously came back to life. And even though he was supposed to be in the NICU for 3 weeks, he was only in the NICU for 6 days. He was the fattest baby in there. When they brought him back out, they tested him for all sorts of things, and every test came back clean. He was beautiful and perfect and healthy, and it was totally miraculous. Not getting to hold my baby until he was 6 days old, though, was really, really tough. Plus the infections with my C-section and having a C-section in general, I was in an incredible amount of pain, and there was a time when I didn't think I'd ever walk again. Every single baby step left me sobbing in agony, no matter how much medication they would give me. But over time, I healed, and we took our baby home, and life was crazy because we still had therapy and preschool for my other 2, and Jacob was still trying to figure out the job situation. But we were witnessing miracles. Benjamin, having such a rough birth, meant that he was able to get into this developmental pediatrician that only took newborns and siblings of existing patients. So because Benjamin was able to get seen by them, and he was totally fine, even though they checked on him every 6 months, he was doing great. But because he was being seen by them, Aurora and Josh were able to get into this developmental pediatrician, which was incredible and life-changing. We were able to start Joshua on medication and Aurora on medication that just has changed our lives for the better in so many ways. I believe it was August of 2014 that we finally got in to get Aurora and Joshua. Well, Aurora reevaluated for autism and Joshua diagnosed for the first time. Joshua was easy, hands down, severe autism. He still wasn't talking. He was 3 at this time, still wasn't talking at all. It was very easy for him to be diagnosed with autism, and it wasn't shocking because I already was expecting it. I knew it was coming. So Joshua was diagnosed with autism. Aurora was diagnosed with social pragmatic communication disorder, but nobody knew what that was. During this time, I decided to go back to school, and I did a research paper on the DSM-5 and on autism, and I really did my research. And I realized that Aurora probably should have an autism diagnosis, and I wrote down a list of all the reasons why diagnostically and all of her behaviors that were consistent with autism, and I took that information back to the developmental pediatrician, and I was able to get her a new autism diagnosis. So this was now her 3rd diagnosis, her 2nd autism diagnosis, and that brought back all the services that we needed. She was in preschool. Joshua started preschool at the Foundation School for Autism, which is its own amazing miracle school. I can't say enough good things about that school. And we just saw a lot of miracles. Joshua started medication. It was really hard at first because we had to find the right medication to work for him. And the first few that we tried did not work. And life was slowly balancing out. But Jacob was struggling because he was off opioids, but he was still in a ton of pain. There was actually a time when he was able to go back on the opioids on lower doses, but he was also on an antidepressant, which helped him stay balanced and helped him not go overboard with his medication again. It was a delicate thing, but we managed to make it work. But over time, Jacob became more and more disabled. In 2015, he was in the hospital about once a month. At one point, his asthma was so bad that he was using his EpiPen like 3 days in a row because of his really severe asthma. There was one time when his leg buckled out from underneath him and he collapsed to the floor. And we went in and they accused him of making it all up. He couldn't even walk, and they accused him of making it up and drug seeking. And then there was the hemiplegic migraine, where he was basically paralyzed for 9 hours. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He went to the ER by ambulance. And even as he laid there, unable to speak and move, they pulled me out and said that he was just drug seeking, which didn't make any sense at all. Because he wasn't even asking for drugs. He couldn't even talk. They sent him home after that ER trip with just me and our truck, and he couldn't hold his own weight up. It was a pretty brutal experience. So this entire time we were on the wait list for ABA therapy, another miracle and trial. Both Aurora and Joshua were able to start ABA in the summer of 2015. But that meant driving half an hour away, and then they would get 4 hours of therapy, and then we would drive them back home. And it was kind of brutal. We also were able to get SeaWorld passes that year, and little 1-year-old Benjamin learned how to walk at SeaWorld. And while we loved SeaWorld and it was so much fun, Jacob was walking on a cane. He was struggling to move. He was struggling with his depression and his anxiety and his yet-to-be-diagnosed PTSD. He was struggling with pain. And then Aurora and Joshua were in ABA for 4 hours a day all summer. And it was a really crazy time. By the end of that summer, Jacob had surgery on his back to implant a spinal stimulator. And that surgery was... it was a rough surgery. The recovery from that was so much more difficult than we ever could have anticipated. But eventually, recovery happened, physically, at least, with the spinal stimulator, and it helped. But life was still really hard. Jacob was trying to work, but he kept collapsing, and we didn't know why. Eventually, after seeing all of the neurologists in San Antonio, who just wrote him off and would not take him seriously, he finally did his own research and figured out what it was. And then his primary care doctor confirmed it, and Jacob was diagnosed with familial episodic ataxia, which basically means that whenever he is stressed out, his body stops functioning and he collapses. He stutters and struggles to speak. He can't hold his own body weight, and I would have to carry him to bed. He would stay there for days until he could get his strength back. He'd go to work with his dad and he'd collapse. He would try to vacuum and he would collapse. We got to the point where he was collapsing multiple times a week, And the only reason that he wasn't collapsing more was because all the rest of his time was spent in bed. With 3 little kids, and 2 of them with autism, and at this point, Aurora and Joshua were in school, and then they were doing ABA after school, and then I was trying to do school online while they sat at ABA, and Jacob was trying to watch Benjamin at home. It was rough. We had a rough time. And that's how life was for a couple years. School and more school and therapy and Benjamin. And I guess I should mention, while Benjamin was a great baby, he was a terrible toddler. Terrible. I could not put my finger on it, but he was often harder than Joshua. And Joshua was hard. Joshua was really hard. But Benjamin was so stubborn and defiant right from the moment he could talk and before that. So defiant, so stubborn. And it was a little bit funny, when it's a 1-year-old, but it was draining and exhausting all the time. And I could not figure out what was going on because I knew he was so much more aware than Joshua. I didn't think it could be autism. But we would stand there at the baby gate at the kitchen, and I'd stand there with a granola bar, and Joshua still wasn't talking. And I'd say, okay, say buh, buh, buh. And Benjamin was only 1 or 2, and Joshua just couldn't talk. And so Joshua would pat his cheeks and buh, buh, and like try. And Benjamin would take one look at me, glare at me, and then lay on the floor and scream. It was rough getting through that time. But time went by, things kind of leveled out. Jacob got some good doctors, he got on some good medication, he started counseling and therapy, things kind of evened out. And then we applied for Social Security for Joshua and Aurora. Aurora was denied, but Joshua was accepted. We also applied for SSI for Jacob a few years later when he became disabled, and he was denied at first. But finally, our miracle happened in 2018 when he was accepted. He was approved for SSI. He was officially disabled. And right about that time, those spiritual promptings came back, and we knew that it was time for us to move back to Utah and finish our degrees. It's been 10 years since we had gotten married, and we were going to move back to Utah and finish our degrees. But it seemed crazy. It seemed impossible. We had everything established in San Antonio. We had all the doctors, we had all the therapists, we had all the schools. Everything was all ready and established. And I just didn't know how we could survive, how we could make this move work. And we went to the temple and we prayed about it. And for the first time in my life, I got a really clear answer. And I said, Heavenly Father, are we going to be okay? I was wanting to pray, is this right? But I already knew. I already knew it was right. And I said, are we going to be okay? And he told me clear as day, it's not just going to be okay, it's going to be amazing. And so we got ready to move back to Utah. And boy, that was a rough move. I cannot even begin. It was so hard. Trying to find a place to live that we could survive in, that didn't have stairs, that didn't have people living under us. Because I had kids with autism who screamed. I had a husband who couldn't climb stairs. What were we going to do? Trying to find a place to live from states away seemed impossible, especially one that was in our budget, especially one that would accept us when our credit was trashed. The only reason we could afford to move was because we'd gotten back pay from SSI. So I finally found our miracle house. I found it. I was so excited. And we had a friend walk through it, and we put the deposit down, and we were going to pay them a full year of rent in advance. And Jacob just didn't have a good feeling about it, so he decided to fly up to Utah, which I was scared to death for because he could still barely walk. He was still collapsing all the time. So he flew up to Utah to go see this place. And he went to the rental agency, and they would not give him the key. We'd already paid the deposit and 2 months' rent, and they would not give him the key to the house because he hadn't paid the full year yet. And he's going, I just want to walk through it and see it. He finally was able to give them collateral so that he could get the key to go walk through this house we were supposed to move into. He was finally able to go walk through it, and it was awful. It wasn't livable. There was a humongous pit in the backyard that we were supposed to climb into to change the filters. that was so dangerous, this big uncovered hole in the ground that was super dangerous for our kids. Our kids couldn't play in the backyard with a huge hole in the ground that they would fall into and get hurt in. And the rental company refused to budge. They refused to do anything about it. And Jacob calls me and says, we can't live here. We can't do it. And I just broke down sobbing because I didn't know what to do. We were supposed to move like in 2 weeks and we didn't have anywhere to live. And I was just beside myself. But Jacob was adamant, we can't live here. We have to find someplace else. So I, in a total panic attack, started searching for other listings, trying to find something, anything. And what I found was a miracle house. Another miracle house. I found it. It was amazing. It had 5 bedrooms. It was like actually in our price range. It was a single house that didn't have anyone living on top of us or below us. And he was able to go look at it, and it had really tall, awful grass, but it looked really good, and he was able to go walk through it. The other company refused to give us any of our money back. It was over $3,000, $3 or $4,000, something like that, for 2 months' rent and a deposit, and they wouldn't give it back to us, even though we never moved in. We tried to take them to court, but they had bigger, badder lawyers than us, and the judge said, well, this is not my jurisdiction, and dropped the case. And they said, if you ever try to get this money back from us, we'll sue you into the ground. So just like that, we lost about $3 or $4,000 from that first house. But we were able to move into our new house. It had 5 bedrooms, which was a miracle. It was amazing. We were so happy. It was a very difficult drive up there. We pulled a U-Haul with all of our stuff. This amazing person, my amazing friend Emily, showed up to help us move in. We got there at like 5 o'clock at night, got the keys. We'd been driving for days to get there. I think it took us 3 days to drive the 24-hour drive there. And my amazing friend Emily showed up with her kids and with paper towels and sodas and pizzas and helped us move all of our stuff in. And it was crazy, but it worked. It was a difficult thing, but it was also so miraculous. So we moved in and we got settled, sort of. And less than a month after that, my brother got married in Oregon and Washington, right on the border. We kind of went back and forth. And so we all drove out there for his wedding. And after that, I swore we would never travel again because traveling with my kids is so, so difficult. Now remember, the Lord had told me it's not just going to be okay, it's going to be amazing. But somehow, what followed was the worst year of our marriage, of my life so far. It was even harder than 2013, I think. The toss-up. Those two were both really difficult. Jacob and I were both in school full-time. We were both at BYU. All 3 kids were at different schools. Benjamin was in preschool a few days a week, which we had to pay for, even though we could barely afford it. But we had to pay for it because Utah doesn't really do preschool, and we couldn't get him to qualify for special needs preschool. We tried. I really tried hard, but he did not qualify. We finally found Joshua an amazing school to attend, which had really been a source of stress for me. But we were all 5 of us in school, and it was wild. It was very difficult to maintain that. So right in the middle of all that craziness, Joshua got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. The middle of October 2018, Joshua suddenly got really sick. He looked like a skeleton overnight. He just woke up one morning and looked like a skeleton. I had no clue anything was wrong before that. But when he woke up that morning, my heart broke. But the thing was, I'm pretty logical, and none of his symptoms really seemed ER-worthy. He was lethargic. He looked really skinny. He puked a little bit. He didn't want to eat. He was very unlike his normal wild self. But it wasn't really ER-worthy. So we just kind of made it through the weekend, and then I took him to the pediatrician, and they completely wrote him off. I had to carry him into the pediatrician's office because he couldn't walk on his own. My wild, wild boy could not walk on his own. And they said, oh, it's probably just the flu or something. Give it a few more days. And I'm going, I've never seen anything like this. We have been through lots of things, and I have never seen anything like this. So a few days go by, and instead of getting better, he gets worse. And I finally said enough is enough, and I took him to the ER, and he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I was so worried he was going to break the hospital. So worried that he was just going to pop back up to his normal self any minute and just tear apart the whole hospital. But he didn't. I had to learn how to give my son shots multiple times a day for the rest of his life. I learned that I had to now pay attention to every single bite that he eats so that I can dose him accordingly and keep him alive. And that was really hard. But life goes on, right? He went back to school, and for the first time in his life, he pooped in the potty. He was 7. He'd been pee potty trained for a few years, but he was still pooping his pants consistently, and he pooped in the potty for the first time in his life. And here we are at 7 years old, and he still didn't have a single sound that meant anything. He couldn't talk at all. Completely and utterly nonverbal. But within the next month, after getting diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, his speech skyrocketed. He now talks constantly. It's still really hard to understand, so I still consider him nonverbal, but he talks to us constantly, and it is a true miracle because there was a time when I had given up on him ever talking. But more stuff was on its way. December came, and the week before Christmas, our landlord showed up. We'd never met him. We had no idea who he was. He showed up, got in a fight with my husband, and pointed his gun in my husband's face. And after so many years of counseling and therapy and working on his PTSD and his anxiety and his depression, it all came back with a vengeance. He was in bed for days. It was awful. I wasn't sure that we'd be able to come back from this one. And he said, "We have to move. We cannot live here anymore. We have to move." And I said, "How are we supposed to move? How are we supposed to do that? There's nowhere else to live. We're all in school. I don't have time to move us." And he still couldn't walk, and he still couldn't carry stuff without collapsing. So the semester ended in April. And even though I was doing summer and spring terms in school, I was looking for a place for us to move to. And it was rough. We still had terrible credit. We no longer had the ability to pay a full year's rent up front. And now we had this awful thing on our credit history. Oh, and I should probably mention that our apartment in San Antonio had screwed up and put somebody else's bill under our names and ruined our credit with it. And we did get it fixed eventually, but it took a couple years to get that fixed. So we had a really difficult time finding a place. I would apply, we'd spend money we didn't have on an application fee, and then they would deny us. And it happened over and over again. And it was really difficult even to find a place I was willing for us to live in. There were a lot of really awful places that I looked at, but it was really hard to find something that we could afford that would work for us. Finally, the school year was about to begin. We didn't have a place for Josh to go to school because he'd aged out of the preschool he was in. So he was now in 2nd grade, but he didn't have a school to go to. We didn't know what school district we were going to live in. Aurora and Benjamin started school, and then we finally found it. We finally found a place to call home that worked for us, that we could feel peace at. And it was only about 15 minutes away. It was in a different school district, but because it was in a different school district, we were able to get Josh into a really amazing school that I had tried to get him into when we first moved to Utah, but I couldn't because we ended up moving into a different school district. So Josh was a couple days late in starting school, but this school has been incredible, and we've been there ever since. We still drive the other two 15 minutes across town to go to their school, but life got drastically better after that. Benjamin went to the eye doctor and needed glasses about the same time that we moved. And of course, moving is always awful. Moving is just the worst, even if it's only across town. But we moved. We got settled. I continued with school. I forgot to mention that. The other thing that happened in 2018 was that I auditioned for the School of Music again, 10 years after the last time that I had auditioned. And I was just sure that the School of Music was the reason that we had moved back, that was the reason for everything going wrong. That was what was going to make everything worth it. And even though Josh was diagnosed with diabetes and we were dealing with these landlord issues, I was practicing the best I could. I was taking voice lessons. I was doing everything I could to be prepared for this audition. And I auditioned and I got through the first round. in the middle of all of that craziness in December, I got through the first round. And the second round was in February or March. And for the first time in my life, felt like I actually did really well in my audition. And then I got the news that once again I was not accepted. And man, it tore me to pieces. It tore me to pieces. I was shattered. I couldn't sing for months. And I didn't know how I could possibly graduate from the school of family life that just reminded me what a failure I was. This major that just reminded me that I wasn't good enough to do what I wanted to do. So I decided, even though I was really close to graduation, I decided to apply to double major. Even though the odds were heavily stacked against me, I applied to double major in theater studies with an emphasis in costume design. And by some miracle, they approved me. I was like 2 classes away from graduation, and I've heard that they almost never approve double majors, but they approved mine. I'd been in school for over a decade, and they approved my double major. And oh my goodness, I loved it so much. I loved learning makeup and costume design. It was so much fun. Of course, I still long to perform, and I'm still working on that dream, but I learned so much in that major, and I loved my time in it. So, 2019 came, we were in school, Jacob graduated, Benjamin was struggling in kindergarten and first grade. And then the pandemic hit, and everyone was home, and the world said, "This is the worst thing that's ever happened to us." And we said, "This is the easiest year we've ever had." Because truthfully, it was. It was hard for me to be in school and take classes online at BYU and try to help my kids do online school. It was hard, don't get me wrong. But boy, we had been through so much worse. Beginning of 2020, Benjamin was diagnosed with ADHD officially and started medication. Within the next year, he officially was diagnosed with autism. He had originally been diagnosed with ODD, but that was changed to pathological demand avoidance, which is very similar to ODD, but it's anxiety-based, and it falls into the autism spectrum. So while Benjamin is very high-functioning in his autism, he really struggles with anxiety and outbursts of rage. He's now been suspended from school many times, and it's a problem, and we're working on it a lot. But because he got his autism diagnosis, he's been able to get ABA along with Aurora and Joshua. The other thing that happened during the pandemic was that I had gastric sleeve surgery, and over the last year I've lost about 100 pounds, which has been fantastic, but it's also been a trial for me because somehow my self-esteem has actually plummeted with weight loss. It turns out that once you lose 100 pounds, you don't turn into a skinny person. You just kind of deflate, and your body still is flabby and fat, even though it's smaller than it was. And that is a really difficult thing to handle mentally. So these days, I graduated from school back in April, and we've been doing school for the kids, ABA in the afternoons, and me keeping busy doing all sorts of stuff. Life never settles down, does it? Life is still crazy. Life is still wild. But if I've learned anything from all this, it's how to keep going. Because there have been so many times when I wanted to give up, but I just couldn't. There was always something good to live for. And even though life is still really hard, I have found that seeking for sunshine helps me in ways I never could have imagined. I wish I'd had this philosophy my entire life. And I think part of me, I think it was there a little bit. I just didn't have the words for it. But I really feel so strongly about looking for something good, especially something good in the chaos that is surrounding us. Because the chaos has not ended. Life is still wild. I have to leave in 2 minutes to go donate plasma because that's life, right? I hope that you hear my story and that it can inspire you to keep going when the world crashes down on you because, oh my goodness, I know what that feels like. I have lived it. We had a decade of hell, and there are so many more things that I could get into that happened to us during that time that I didn't talk about. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that you can get something out of my story, And I really hope that you will share your story with us. We want to hear your story on Seeking Sunshine. We want you to tell it here, and we want you to tell all the gory details as much as you're comfortable with. We want to hear all of it. We want to be inspired by your strength and your perseverance and your ability to find sunshine even when life is awful. Thanks for joining me, and don't forget to seek the sunshine. 'Cause I'm seeking sunshine. I'm seeking sunshine. I'm seeking sunshine. Oh, 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 oh. I'm seeking sunshine. I'm seeking sunshine. I'm seeking sunshine.